Alrighty, hello everyone. This is Hack the Planet and Space 2, a very quick introduction to satellite hacking. So I am Rachel Velasco, and thank you so much for supporting BSides Charlotte this year. So let's get started. A little bit more about me. Every time I play Among Us, I am one of the imposters without fail. And the theme of this year's B-Sides is what I learned in quarantine. And unfortunately, I was one of the many people whose mental health was greatly affected by the pandemic. So my depression and anxiety, I've been struggling with those for several years now, and it definitely worsened my imposter syndrome within InfoSec. And I couldn't find any joy with my work or with what I was learning in school, and I felt that I was constantly defending myself and having to explain why I belonged in InfoSec. And eventually it got to the point where I thought it would be so much better if I just got ejected. But anyway, my treatment plan was revised, and one of the first things that I got excited about in a long time, what felt like a long time, was satellite hacking. And I'm, excuse me, I am back to work now in school, and I've taken up some leadership roles in some tech organizations. And I'm definitely not an expert, but I am very excited to share what I learned about hacking space with all of y'all. So let's go over the agenda. I'll be discussing exactly what satellites are, how you can go about attacking them, and more resources for learning more on your own and getting some practice in. So, satellites. But first, I have some news. In March of this year, this article came out how space is becoming a lot more dangerous. And the Army Space and Missile Defense Commander, he said that they have a lot of new tools like interceptors, which is anti-missile weapons, hypersonic missiles, and directed energy weapons. And he said it was pretty darn awesome. Well, yes, that is super awesome. However, they are applying this technology to satellites. And just a couple of months ago, as of this recording, Russia conducted an anti-satellite weapons test, but this anti-satellite weapon is on a satellite. So these satellites are becoming more and more dangerous. So why would you want to hack a satellite? What even is a satellite? Well, in this context, an artificial satellite is any object that was intentionally placed into orbit. And they have a lot of different purposes depending on what orbit they're on. But for the most part, there's communications, navigation, for science, like weather monitoring and whatnot. And for recon, there are a lot of spy satellites up there right now. So, the orbits by altitude. I'm only going to be talking about 3, but there are quite a lot of them. And this first one is called the low Earth orbit. And satellites here, they're generally for communications, but you'll also find the International Space Station, the Hubble telescope, and the US Iridium communication satellite system. And this requires the lowest amount of energy to deploy and keep in orbit. Next, we have the medium Earth orbit. And there's a subclassification called semi-synchronous. And what that means is it's consistent. The satellites on this orbit pass the same 2 spots on the equator every single day. And in medium Earth orbit, you'll tend to find a lot of the navigational satellites like GPS and GLONASS, which is, I believe, Global Navigation Satellite System. And finally, the last one is not high Earth orbit, even though it is considered an orbit, but it is a geosynchronous orbit. So geosynchronous means that at the same time every day, you will find the satellite at the same point in the sky. Excuse me. And there's a special kind of geosynchronous satellite called geostationary. And geostationary means that It doesn't matter what time of day you look up in the sky, that satellite will always be in the same spot. And of the geostationary satellites, a lot of them will be commercial communications or broadcasting. And since it's so high up, you'll have a constant view of a large surface area from up there. There's also the geostationary operational environmental satellites, or the GOES. So a lot of these, they tend to function like scientifically. They have weather monitoring. You can see all the hurricanes, wildfires from up there, and they can also detect distress signals from ships and planes. So they're also very helpful with search and rescue. And a little bit past the geostationary orbit is the graveyard orbit, and this is where satellites go to die. And so all of these defunct satellites that no longer serve their purpose or are broken and can't be fixed for some reason, they end up becoming space debris. And China tried solving this problem with an anti-satellite missile, and it did hit the satellite that they were intending to hit, but it just split into a bajillion more pieces and spread it out everywhere. So, yes. And there's also the problem of collisions. There's the space debris and the still functional satellites. Not too long ago, there was a defunct Russian satellite that collided with a functioning US Iridium satellite, and they ended up colliding, yes, and their debris went back to Earth, and so there's a lot of like radioactive material that they dumped in. I think it landed in the US. So that's a giant problem with these defunct satellites colliding. And there's also the issue of light pollution. All of these satellites in orbit are blocking the view of other celestial bodies, so scientists have been complaining about this. Now, how do you go about attacking satellites? There's this wonderful paper by the US Air Force NASIC called Competing in Space. And there are a couple threats that they list to space systems. So I'll be talking about the user and ground segment in one part, and then the link segment and the space segment. And if you noticed, there are a lot of familiar terms because satellites are basically computers. So what they call the signals that a satellite receives is the uplink. The downlink is the signals that the satellite sends down back to Earth, to ground stations and to phones and whatever other endpoints there are. So what exactly is a ground station? It's just a fancy radio station that communicates exclusively with a satellite. And honestly, it's just a fancy computer and antenna combination. So this would be the cheapest way to take over the satellite, since you could just hack into it like you normally would a usual computer. But unfortunately, since it is a usual computer, there are logs. So there will be a trace of when you have like tried to interfere with this ground station. And there was this instance back, I believe it was 2008. There was the Terra Earth Observation System satellite, and NASA found that the responsible party achieved all steps required to command the satellite, but did not issue commands. So whoever hacked into this satellite, they had control over it, but they didn't issue any commands to like change its inclination or anything. But this happened 10 years ago, so satellite hacking is not a new thing. Next, we have the link segment. So satellites have a communication payload module, which have a transmitter receiver on it, or a transponder, and they usually have a bandpass filter. So this makes sure it only allows frequencies within a certain range. And they will also have a low noise amplifier because these signals tend to travel very long distances from the ground stations. So it will amplify those signals and make sure they are heard. And like with typical wireless attacks, satellite link segment attacks are susceptible to spoofing, replay attacks, and eavesdropping. There was a wonderful talk earlier this year at DEF CON by James Pavur called Whispers Among the Stars about them eavesdropping on satellite communications. And it was very cool, but also very scary. And finally, we have jamming. So there have been many instances of countries jamming each other's satellites, and what makes jamming different from normal interference is that jamming is intentional. So there have been times where the US they have found Iran jamming their GPS satellites. There's been issues with Russia and China and all the usual people. Now this space segment. Can you physically hack a satellite that's in space? Yes, you can slap a hardware implant on there, but that requires a lot of money. So this is normally reserved for nation state actors and bored billionaires, but this is purely theoretical. There's not a lot that we know about it, and it probably has happened, but it's very highly classified. So to recap the threats to satellites, there is the grounding user component, the link segment, and the space segment. So here are some more resources for learning more on your own. There is this cool open source project called SatNogs, and it's a network of many ground stations just made by average people. And they have a crowdsourced satellite info database. And there's actually one fairly close to here. I believe it's in Weddington, and that's station 642, and you can see all the satellites that it's been tracking. It's very, very cool. And the Aerospace Village this year had Nyansat, and this was a giant collaboration with the US Air Force and Red Balloon Security. And they had a build your own ground station kit for only $1. So as you can imagine, they sold out very, very quickly. But they do have all the parts listed on their website for building your own ground station with them. And there's a lot of helpful info on their website still. And finally, we have a lot of simulation software from NASA. There is 42, which is simulating altitude and trajectory dynamics. There's a lot of math involved with hacking satellites, which I definitely will not go into. But 42 is very helpful with determining the math you need for hacking a satellite, since you have to be able to see them to hack it. And there's also NOS Cubed, the NASA operational simulator for small satellites. And there's also this very cool project called the Cubesat Sim Project. And a CubeSat is a very, very tiny simulator, a very tiny satellite, and it only weighs a couple pounds. So there are quite a lot of them up in orbit right now. And I actually got to build my own as well, and it is sitting in my closet, unfortunately. But yes, it's fairly cheap. All the parts together are less than $100 to build your own, so I highly recommend building your own CubeSat sim. So some more organizations to learn from. Highly recommend the Aerospace Village. They have all of their talks and workshops from this year's DEF CON on their YouTube channel. There's also the Defense Digital Service. They were the ones who ran the Hackasat competition at DEF CON this year. And finally, the Libre Space Foundation. They are a big organization. They have many open source projects like the SatNogs. They also have the UPSat, CubeSat, and Pocket Cube satellites that you can build on your own. So there's a lot of cool documentation on their website, and I highly suggest checking them out. So thank you very much. I am Rachel Velasco, and please let me know if you have any questions. I will definitely do my best to answer them. But again, I am not an expert. But yes, hack the planet in space.